Y'all doing? Welcome back. Welcome back to Reading with Shilo. Reading with Shilo. We in this thing once again. Well, we finished up Mr. Mariel Windsor's book and Mr. Rudolph R. Windsor's book, Barack and Deborah United, which was definitely better than I expected. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the next book, Narrative of Life. The Narrative of the Life of Frederick L. Douglass. This is Black History Month. Black History Life. But we'll jump into a book about Mr. Frederick L. Douglass. This is a book by the Dover Thrift Edition. Dover Publishings or Publications, Garden City, New York. Copywritten in 1995. A carefully curated library of the world's greatest Dover Thrift Editions. A carefully curated library of the world's greatest literature. Dover Thrift Editions are the most affordable choices for today's readers. The series offers a vast selection of complete and unabridged titles, each a classic work of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, or drama. Former slave, impassioned abolitionist, brilliant writer, newspaper editor, and eloquent orator whose speeches fired the abolitionist cause, Frederick Douglass from 1881 to 1895 led an astounding life. Physical abuse, deprivation, and tragedy plagued his early years, yet through sheer force of character, he was able to overcome these obstacles to become a leading spokesman for his people. In this, the first and most eloquent and most frequently read of his three autobiographies, Douglass provides graphic descriptions of his childhood and horrifying experiences as a slave, as well as a harrowing record of his dramatic escape to the North and eventual freedom. Published in 1845 to quell doubts about his origins, since few slaves of that period could write, the narrative is admired today for its extraordinary passion, sensitive and vivid descriptions, and storytelling power. It belongs in the library of everyone interested in African American history and the life of one of the country's most courageous and influential champions of civil rights. Shalom, shalom. What's up, Jessica? Ms. Robbins. We're going to see what Mr. Frederick Douglass talking about. So we have the Encyclopedia of African American Heritage. Got about the same picture of Mr. Douglass right there. We're going to see what this says, and then we're going to read chapter 1 of this one. Douglass Frederick, or Frederick Douglass, 1817 to 1895. The most important African American leader of the 19th century, abolitionist, journalist, diplomat. He is often called the father of the civil rights movement. Born a slave, Frederick Douglass never knew his father, nor did he know the exact date of his birth. He picked February 14th as his birthday because his mother, who died when he was 7, used to refer to him as a little Valentine. When Douglass was 8, his master, Thomas Auld, lent him out to work for a family in Baltimore. There he learned to read and write and was relatively well treated. In 1833, He was still in his teens. He was still in his teens. In 1833, Douglas was returned to Ald. When he resisted Ald's cruel treatment, he was hired out to a Negro breaker named Covey, who whipped Douglas repeatedly and forced him to labor in the fields from 12 to 14 hours a day. Later, Douglas was hired out to another farmer, William Freeland. But after an attempted escape, he was sent back to Baltimore. There, he was hired out to work in the shipyards, where he was attacked and almost blinded in one eye. With the help of Anne Moray, a free-born African-American woman, whom he later married, Douglas escaped to New York. From there, he made his way to New Bedford, Massachusetts. Some of these names are worse than the names in the Bible for me sometimes. Where he dropped the name he had carried since birth, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, and took the name of Frederick Douglass. He became a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and was so effective a speaker that some people questioned whether he had ever really been a slave. In response, Douglas wrote an autobiography in which he provided so much detailed information that he jeopardized his own safety and was forced to flee to England. There, he continued to speak against slavery and to argue in favor of Irish freedom, women's rights, and world peace. His growing fame made it impossible for him to return to the United States while still a fugitive, so a group of supporters arranged to purchase his freedom. Arriving back in the United States in 1847, Douglas settled in Rochester, New York, where he began publication of the North Star newspaper. Financially, it was an extremely risky venture, but Douglas believed he could not continue to filter his thoughts through a white abolitionist press. The difficulty he had anticipated proved correct. Within 6 months, he was forced to mortgage his home to keep the paper going. He continued to lecture against slavery and suffered a broken arm after being attacked by a pro-slavery mob in Indiana. He also arranged for a printing shop to be used as a station on the Underground Railroad. Under the course of 10 years, more than 400 escaped slaves found help there. In 1848, Douglas met with John Brown, who later led the unsuccessful raid on Harper's Ferry. In fact, Brown spent 3 weeks at Douglas's house shortly before the 1854-59 raid. Douglas thought Brown's plan suicidal, but could not convince him to change it. Even though Douglas did not join the attempted uprising, he was forced to flee to Canada when the governor of Virginia swore out a warrant for his arrest as an accomplice. He returned to the United States in 1860. Man, this boy was always on the run. He was on the run back to back. England, Canada. When the Civil War broke out, Douglas pressed President Lincoln to free all the slaves immediately and to allow African Americans to enlist in the Union forces. It was not until 1863, however, that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in Confederate territory and allowing blacks to enlist. Douglas moved immediately to recruit black soldiers. His own 2 sons were among the first to enlist, but the outrageous treatment of black Union soldiers caused Douglas to halt his recruitment efforts. The unequal pay, inferior equipment, segregated units, and lack of black officers was infuriating enough. Even worse were the reports of Confederate atrocities against African American soldiers. He met with Lincoln concerning these matters, but was unable to get a satisfactory response. Douglas feared that the North might agree to end the war should the Southern states offer to return to the Union, provided they could keep their slaves. People were tired of fighting, dismayed by the ever-lengthened list of debts and wounded, and apprehensive of the mounting financial costs. To block any attempt to end the war by selling out African American rights, he embarked on a speaking tour. Again and again, Douglas reported his 4 main points that are that the aim of the war should be the abolition of slavery, that there could be no peace that did not include the end to slavery, that everyone was entitled to the same rights, and that black men should have to have the vote. Once the war was over, Douglas began pressing for black voting and economic rights. Ironically, this forced a serious break between him and a group whose cause he had always championed, women. The 15th Amendment gave the vote to black men. It said nothing about women, and as a result, it was opposed by leaders in the women's movement. Douglas had always been a strong supporter of women's suffrages, but he was not willing to jeopardize the black male vote for it. The break with the women's movement was painful for Douglas, but he saw no alternative. Douglas also became entangled in an unsuccessful effort to save the Freedmen Saving and Trust Company, a bank started in 1865 for newly freed slaves. Knowing that the bank's collapse would cost thousands of former slaves their life savings, Douglas took over the presidency of the institution and even invested his own money in it. However, in 1874, the Freedmen's Bank was forced to close, and many depositors lost all or most of their money. In 1877, President Hayes appointed Douglas Marshal of the District of Columbia. 4 years later, President Garfield made him Recorder of Deeds, a post Douglas held for 5 years. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison named him Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In each of these posts, Douglas served with distinction. On February 20th of 1895, Frederick Douglass died of a heart attack. Save the Negro and you save the nation, he said. Destroy the Negro and you destroy the nation. And to save both, you must have but one great law of liberty, equality and fraternity for all Americans without respect to color. What I ask for the Negro is not benevolence, not pity, not sympathy, but simple justice. That was Frederick Douglass. Let's get started. Let's get started. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. I've never read it. I've never read about Mr. Frederick Douglass other than a little bit, right there, what I just read for the most part. But we're going to see what Mr. Douglass got to say, or what they got to say about the life of Mr. Douglass. Note, perhaps the most powerful and influential Black American of his time, Frederick Douglass, from 1818 to 1895, that one said 1817, embodied the tumultuous social changes that transformed the United States during the 19th century. In a career of unprecedented breadth, Douglass rose from the oppression of his slave's birth to become the international famous writer and orator, one of the most of the emancipated slaves after the Confederate surrender. An effective molder of public opinion, Douglass was a tireless lecturer and an essayist, and the editor of a succession of periodicals that solidified his renown while contributing significantly to the public discourse on a variety of issues. Douglass's own experiences as a former slave formed the basis of his immensely captivating presence as an orator, and served as a major component of the 3 autobiographies published during his lifetime. The first of these, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, appeared in 1845. A few years after Douglass's dramatic 1841 debut into the world of professional moral oratory, written in part to counter the incredulity, the incredulity of audiences dubious that a speaker of Douglas's eloquence could have emerged virtually unaided from such a lowly background, and featuring introductions by noted white abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips. The narrative, was an immediate sensation, inflaming anti-slavery sentiments in the North and abroad. In 1845, text reprinted here is especially valued among Douglas' writings as the most immediate account of his youthful captivity. Douglas' expanded second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855, is also available from Dover Publications. And if you wanted, the ISBN number is 0486224570. All right, it has 11 chapters, and we're going to read the preface and chapter 1. The preface and chapter 1. Chapter 1. All right. Yeah, we'll do that. The preface and chapter 1. Preface. In the month of August, 1841, I attended an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, at which it was my happiness to become acquainted with Frederick Douglas, the writer of the following narrative. He was a stranger to nearly every member of that body, but having recently made his escape from the Southern prison house of bondage and feeling his curiosity excited to ascertain the principles and measures of the abolitionists, of whom he had heard a somewhat vague description while he was a slave, he was induced to give his attendance on the occasion alluded to, though at the time a resident of New Bedford. Fortunately, most fortunate occurrence. Fortunate for the millions. I'm tripping. Fortunate for the millions of his manacled brethren, yet painting for deliverance for their awful thraldom. Fortune for the cause of Negro emancipation and of universal liberty. Fortune for the land of his birth, which he has already done so much to save and bless. Fortunate for the large circle of friends and acquaintances whose sympathy and affection he has strongly secured by the many sufferings he has endured, by his virtuous traits of character, by his ever abating remembrance of those who are in bond as being bond with them. What's up, my boy? You gonna come listen to me about Mr. Frederick Douglas? You wanna put that on your head? Come on. Come on. Come close. I got you. Get it up. Mom. Now you're good to go. Fortunate for the multitudes in various parts of our republic, whose minds he has enlightened on the subject of slavery, and who have been melted to tears by his pathos, or roused to virtuous indignation by his stirring eloquence against the enslavers of men, fortunate for himself, as it at once brought him into the field of public usefulness. Give the world assurance of a man, quicken the slumbering energies of his soul, and consecrate him to the great work of breaking the rod of the oppression and letting the oppressed go free. I shall never forget his first speech at the convention. The extraordinary emotion it excited in my own mind, the powerful impression to create upon the crowded auditory, completely taken by surprise, the applause which followed from the beginning to the end of his felicitous remarks. I think I never hated slavery so intensely as at that moment. Certainly, my perception of the enormous outrage which is inflicted by it on the godlike nature of its victims was rendered far more clear than ever. There stood one in physical proportion and stature commanding and exact, in intellect richly endowed, in natural eloquence a prodigy, in soul manifestly created but a little lower than the angels, yet a slave, a fugitive slave, trembling for his safety, hardly daring to believe that on the American soil a single white person could be found who would befriend him at all hazards for the love of God and humanity. Capable of high attainments as an intellectual and moral being, needed nothing but a comparatively small amount of cultivation to make him an ornament to society and a blessing to his race. By the law of the land, by the voice of the people, by the terms of the slave code, he was only a piece of property, a beast of burden, a chattel person nevertheless. A beloved friend from the New Bedford prevailed on Mr. Douglas to address the convention. He came forward to the platform with the hesitancy and embarrassment necessarily the attendance of a sensitive mind in such a novel position. After apologizing for his ignorance and reminding the audience that slavery was a poor school for the human intellect and heart, he proceeded to narrate some of the facts in his own history as a slave, and in the course of his speech gave utterance to many noble thoughts and thrilling reflections. As soon as he was taking his seat, filled with hope and admiration, I rose and declared that Patrick Henry, of revolutionary fame, never made a speech more eloquent in the case of liberty than the one we had just listened. Come here, I can't hear you. Than the one we had just listened to from the lips of the hunted fugitive. Huh? Say it again, son. Do you have to go pee? You have to go pee? I can't hear you. You need to tell me. If you don't say anything, I'm going to take it as a no. Take it as a no, sir. You don't have to go pee. Do you have to go pee, my man? All right. So I believed at that time. Such is my belief now. I reminded the audiences of the peril which surrounded this self-emancipated young man at the North. Even in Massachusetts, on the soil of the Pilgrim farmers among the descendants of revolutionary sires. And I appealed to them whether they would ever allow him to be carried back into slavery, law or no law, constitution or no constitution. The response was unanimous and in thunder tones, no. Yes, sir, in a minute after I read. No. Will you secure and protect him as a brother man, a resident of the old Bay State? Yes, shouted the whole mass with an energy so startling that the ruthless tyrants south of the Mason and Dixon line might almost have heard the mighty burst of feeling and recognized it as a pledge of invincible determination on the part of those who gave it. never to betray him that wanders, but to hide the outcast and firmly to evade the consequences. It was at once deeply impressed upon my mind that if Mr. Douglas could be persuaded to consecrate his time and talents to the promotion of the anti-slavery enterprise, a powerful impetus would be given to it, and a stunning blow at the same time inflicted on the Northern prejudice against the color complexion. I therefore endeavored to instill hope and courage into his mind, in order that he might dare to engage in a vocation so anomalous and responsible for a person in his situation. And I was second in this effort by warm-hearted friends, especially by the late general agent of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, Mr. John A. Collins, whose judgment in the instance entirely coincided with my own. At first, he could give no encouragement. With unfeigned diffidence. I wonder if it's like difference. Difffidence. Diffidence. Let's see what it means. Diffidence. The unfeigned diffidence. Diffidence. With unfeigned diffidence. Difference. Diffi. Difficult. Diffidence is not in here. Let's see if it's on this one. Diffidence. Difffi. Diffidence. I guess that'll be one for Scrabble, baby. Diffidence. Difffi. Diffident. Diffidence. Diffidence, the quality or state of being diffident, hesitant, or acting or speaking through lack of self-confidence. So it's the state of being hesitant in acting or speaking through lack of self-confidence. Diffident. But it's not like difference. Diffident. He expressed his conviction that he was not adequate to the performance of so great a task. The path marked out was wholly an untrodden one. He was sincerely apprehensive that he should do more harm than good. After much deliberation, however, he consented to make a trial. And ever since that period, he has acted as a lecturing agent under the auspices either of the American or the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. In labors, he has been most abundant, and his success in combating prejudice, in gaining proselytes, and agitating the public mind. He has far surpassed the most sanguine expectations that were raised at the commencement of his brilliant career. Sanguine, Sanguine, sanguine. Something dealing with, I get sanguine. Sanguine. Cheerful, optimistic. Sanguine is cheerful and optimistic. In agitating the public mind, has far surpassed the most cheerful and optimistic expectations or sanguine expectations that were raised at the commencement of his brilliant career. He has borne himself with gentleness and meekness, yet with true manliness of character. As a public speaker, he excels in pathos, wit, comparison, imitation, strength of reasoning, and fluency of language. There is in him that union of head and heart, which is indispensable to the enlightenment of the heads and the winning of the hearts of others. May his strength continue to equal to his day. May he continue to grow in peace and in knowledge of God, that he may be increasingly serviceable in the cause of bleeding humanity, whether at home or abroad. It is certainly a very remarkable fact that one of the most efficient advocates of the slave population now before the public is a fugitive slave in the person of Frederick Douglas, and that the free color population of the United States are as able represented by one of their own number in the person of Charles Lennox Remond, whose eloquent appeals have extorted the highest applause of the multitudes in both sides of the Atlantic. Let the culminators of the color race despise themselves for their baseness and illiberality of spirit. And henceforth cease to talk of the natural inferiority of those who require nothing but time and opportunity to attain the highest point of human excellence. Man, this perfect long. No, I'm not putting it on your head. No, sir. It may perhaps be fairly questioned whether any other portion of the population of the earth could have endured the provisions, sufferings, and horrors of slavery without having become more degraded in the scale of humanity than the slaves of African descent. Nothing has been left undone to cripple their intellects, darken their minds, debase their moral nature, obliterate all traces of their relationship to mankind, and yet how wonderful they have sustained the mighty load of the most frightful bondage, under which they have been groaning for centuries. To illustrate the effort of slavery or the effect of slavery in the white man, to show that he has no power of endurance in such a condition superior to those of his black brother, Daniel O'Connell, the distinguished advocate of universal emancipation and the mightiest champion for but not conquered Ireland, relates the following anecdote in a speech delivered by him in the Consolation Hall in Dublin before the Loyal National Repeal Association on March 31st of 1845. Move. Come here. Calm yourself down. If you're in here while I'm reading, what do you need to be doing? You need to be quiet and you need to sit down. Or are you going to stay in here? If you're going to stay in here, it's not a problem. I'd rather you stay in here and let's learn about Mr. Frederick Douglas. But you need to be quiet and leave your brother alone, son. So are you going to sit in here with me? Or you then go on in front then? It's one of the two. Sitting here. All right. You can sit there. Come on. Or you can come sit right here on me. Body heating. No matter, said Mr. O'Connell. Under what suspicious term it may disguise itself, slavery is still hideous. It has a natural and inevitable tendency to brutalize every noble faculty of man. An American sailor who was cast away on the shore of Africa, where he was kept in slavery for 3 years, was, at the expiration of that period, found to be imbruted and stultified. Stultified. I don't know what that word means, stultified. It's not good, though.
It's my helmet, Daddy. It's my helmet.
Stultified.
It's my helmet, Daddy.
S-T-U-L-T.
It's my helmet, Daddy. It's my helmet.
S-T-U-L-T-I-F-I-E-D. Stultified. Stultified. That's what it sounds like. I don't know. I don't know if I want to be stultified. I got to see what stultified means. Stultified. Yes, sir. S-T-U. Stultified. Can you say stultified, DJ? Oh, Lord. I had it. Stultified. To render futile or useless. To cause to be ineffective. Stultified. Stultified. An American sailor who was cast away on the shore of Africa, where he was kept in slavery for 3 years, was, at the expiration of that period, found to be imbruted and rendered useless, stultified, to cause to be ineffective. He was rendered useless or stultified. He had lost all reasoning power, and having forgotten his native language, could only utter some savage gibberish between Arabic and English, which nobody could understand, and which even he himself found difficulty in pronouncing. So much for the humanizing influence of the domestic institution. Admitting this to have been the extraordinary case of the mental deterioration, it proves at least that the white slave can sink as low in the scale of humanity as the black one. Mr. Douglas has very properly chosen to write his own narrative in his own style and according to the best of his ability, rather than to employ someone else. It is, therefore, entirely his own production, and considering how long and dark was the career he had to run as a slave, how few have been his opportunities to improve his mind since he broke his iron fetters, it is, in my judgment, highly credible to his head and heart. He who can peruse it without a tearful eye, a heaving breast, an afflicted spirit, without being filled with an unutterable adherence of slavery and all its abettors, and animated with the determination to seek the immediate overthrow of that execrable execrable system. Without trembling for the fate of his country in the hands of a righteous God, who is ever on the side of the oppressed, and whose arm is not shortened that it cannot save, must have a flinty heart and be qualified to act the part of the trafficker in slaves and the souls of men. I am confident that this is essentially true in all of its statements, that nothing has been set down in malice, nothing exaggerated, nothing drawn from the imagination, that it comes short of the reality rather than overtakes a single fact in regard to slavery as it is. The experience of Frederick Douglass as a slave was not a peculiar one. He was a slave. A slave. It was not a peculiar one. His lot was not especially a hard one. His case may be regarded as a very fair specimen of the treatment of slaves in Maryland, in which state it is conceded that they are better fed and less cruelly treated than in Georgia, Alabama, or Louisiana. Many have suffered incomparably more. Huh? I'm not worried about his son. While very few of the plantations have suffered less than himself. Yet, how deplorable was his situation. What terrible chastisement was inflicted upon his person. What still more shocking outrages were perpetuated upon his mind. With all his noble powers and sublime aspirations, how like a brute was he treated, even by those professing to have the same mind in them that was in Christ Jesus. To what dreadful liabilities was he continually subjected? How destitute of friendly counsel and aid, even in his greatest extremities. How heavy was the midnight of woe, which shrouded in blackness the last ray of hope and filled the future with terror and gloom. What longings for freedom took possession of his breast, and how his misery augmented in proportion as he grew reflective and intelligent, thus demonstrating that a happy slave is an extinct man. How he thought, reasoned, felt that that under the lash of the driver, with the chains upon his limbs, what perils he encountered with the endeavors to escape from the horrible doom, and how signal had been his deliverance and preservation in the midst of the nation of pitiless enemies. This narrative contains many affecting incidents, many passages about great eloquence and power. But I think the most thrilling one of them all is the description Douglas gives of his feelings as he stood soliloquizing respecting his fate and the chances of his one day being a free man on the banks of the Chesapeake Bay, viewing the receding vessels as they flew with their white wings before the breeze, and apostrophizing them as animated by the living spirit of freedom. Who can read that passage and be insensible to the pathos and sublimity compressed into that can all that need be urged in the form of exploitation, expostulation, entreaty, rebuke against the crime of crimes, making man the property of his fellow man. Oh, how accursed is that system which entombs the godlike mind of man, defaces the divine image, reduces those who by creation were grown with glory and honor to a level of the four-footed beast, and exalts the dealers in human flesh above all that is called God. Why should his existence be prolonged 1 hour? It is not evil, only evil, and that continually. What does his presence imply but the absence of the fear of God, all regard for man on the part of the people of the United States? Heaven's speed is eternal overthrow. Heaven's speed is eternal overthrow. I see, my son. Oh, I almost dropped it, my son. Yes, sir. I almost dropped the book on the floor. So profoundly ignorant of the nature of slavery are many persons that they are stubbornly incredulous whenever they read or listen to any recital of the cruelties which are daily inflicted on its victims. They do not deny that the slaves are held as property, but that terrible fact seems to convey to their minds no idea of injustice, exposure to outrage, or savage barbarity. Tell them of cruel scourges, of mutilations and brandings, of scenes of pollution and blood, of the banishment of all light and knowledge, and they affect to be greatly indignant at such enormous exaggerations, such wholesale misstatements, such abominable libels on the character of the Southern planters, as if all the direful outrages were not the natural results of slavery, as if it were less cruel to reduce a human being to the condition of a thing than to give him a severe flagellation, or to deprive him of necessary food. Let's see what flagellation. I want to say it's being beat. Flagellation. Flagellation. I think it's something to do with being beat up or getting beat. Flogged. No, sir, not yet. I'll be done in a minute. I'll be done in a minute, my boy. You're looking for the word flagellation. Flagellation. Flage. Flagellation is not in this one. No, sir, it's not in that. It's not in this dictionary. We're going to try this dictionary. Dictionary. There you go. Dictionary. That says a fin whale, but we're looking for flagellation.
Is that a tail?
Yes, sir. He has a tail.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a fish.
Yes, sir. But we need not FI, we need FL. Flag. Flagrant.
What did you say, Daddy? What did you say, Daddy?
FLGE.
Flagellation.
That's Mr. Frederick Douglas right there. That's Frederick Douglas. That is the letter J. Flagellant. Let me see, son. Let me see. FLAGE.
What is that? Oh,
Daddy. Thank you, son. FLH. Hold on, DJ. Hold on. Flagellation. FLAGELLATION. The act or practice of flagellating. Flagellating. Flagellate. This is a dictionary, sir. Flagellate. Flagellate. To whip, scourge, to drive or punish as if by whipping. That's what I thought it was. You get beat up, flagellate. Y'all want to get flagellated? You want a flagellation? All right, that's good. You don't want that. You don't want a flagellation. You don't want to be flagellated, boy. You don't want to be flagellated. That's not good. I don't want to be flagellated. I don't want to be flagellated. You want some water too? All right. As if whips, chains, thumb screws, paddles, bloodhounds, overseers, drivers, patrols were not all indispensable to keep the slaves down and to give protection to their ruthless oppressors. As if when the marriage institution is abolished, concubinage, adultery, and incest must not necessarily abound when all the rights of humanity are annihilated. I'm reading what it says. When all the rights of humanity are annihilated. Any barriers remain to protect the victim from the fury of the spoiler. When absolute power is assumed over life and liberty, it will not be wielded with destructive sway. Skeptics of this character abound in society. In some few instances, their incredibility arises from a want of reflection, but generally, it indicates a hatred of the light, a desire to shield slavery from the assaults of its foes, a contempt of the colored race, whether bound or free. Your pants on. Your shoes on the right foot too. They're on the right foot. You good? Such will try to discredit the shocking tales of the slave-holding cruelty, which are recorded in this truthful narrative. But they will labor in vain. Mr. Douglas has frankly disclosed the place of his birth, the names of those who claimed ownership in his body and soul, and the names also of those who committed the crimes which he has alleged against them. His statements, therefore, may easily be disproved if they are untrue. In the course of his narrative, he relates two instances of murderous cruelty, in one of which the planter deliberately shot a slave belonging to a neighboring plantation, who had unintentionally gotten within his lordly domain in quest of fish, and in the other, an overseer blew out the brains of a slave who had fled to a stream of water to escape a bloody scourging. Mr. Douglas states that in neither of these instances was anything done by way of legal arrest or judicial investigation. The Baltimore American of March 17th of 1845 relates similar case of atrocity perpetrated with some similar impunity as follows. Shooting a slave. We learn upon the authority of the letter from Charles County, Maryland, received by a gentleman of this city, that a young man named Matthews, a nephew of General Matthews, and whose father it is believed holds an office in Washington, killed one of the slaves upon his father's farm by shooting. The letter states that young Matthews had been left in charge of the farm, that he gave an order to the servant, which was disobeyed. When he proceeded to the house, obtained the gun, and returning, shot the servant. He immediately, the letter continues, fled to his father's residence, where he still remains unmolested. Let it never be forgotten that no slaveholder or overseer has been convicted of any outrage perpetuated on the person of a slave, however diabolical it may be, on the testimony of colored witnesses, whether bond or free. By the slave code, they are adjudged to be as incompetent to testify against the white man, as though they were indeed a part of the brute creation. Hence, there is no legal protection. In fact, whatever there may be in form for the slavery population, or for the slave population, and any amount of cruelty may be inflicted on them with impunity. Is it possible for the human mind to conceive of a more horrible state of society? The effect of a religious profession on the conduct of Southern masters is vividly described in the following narrative, and shown to be anything but salutary. In nature of the case, it must be in the highest degree pernicious. Pernicious. Boy, some of these words today, man. Pernicious. Today, the words today, man. I gotta look up these words today.
What you say, Daddy?
I said, I gotta look up these words today, man. Like the word pernicious or flagellation. Pernicious. Pernicious. For all my spelling bees. Pernicious. It says halo. It says halo, but you're not gonna be bringing that thing up and riding that thing all up in here now. I hear your brother trying to come up in here too with his. Well, I already looked at the word before. Pernicious. Destructive. Destructive. Extremely injurious, or deadly. Pernicious. Pernicious. The degree of destructive, the degree of being deadly, the degree of pernicious. The testimony of Mr. Douglas at this point is sustained by a cloud of witnesses whose veracity is unimpeachable. A slaveholder's profession of Christianity is a palpable imposture. Some of these words don't even sound like they be going together, but I guess that's due to my lack of reading. My lack of reading over the years. Like that don't even sound like it go together. A slaveholder's profession of Christianity is a palpable imposture. He is a felon of the highest grade. He is a man stealer. It is of no importance what you put on the other scale. Reader, are you with a man stealer in sympathy and purpose, or on the side of their downtrodden victims? If with the former, then are you a foe of God and man? Be careful. If with the latter, what are you prepared to do and dare if their belief? In their belief. Be faithful, be vigilant, be untiring in your efforts to break every yoke, and let the oppressed go free. Come what may, cost what it may, inscribe on the banner which you unfurl to the breeze as your religious and political model. No compromise with slavery, no union with slaveholders. Under the guise of what Mr. Douglas is looking at it as, I would agree. But God didn't, it's not a bad thing to have slaves. Necessarily. It's not a bad thing to have slaves. Somebody always gonna be on top, and whoever gonna be on top gonna be a slave or a servant. Whoever on the bottom gonna be a slave or a servant to whoever on top. No, You better watch that big rock wallet head. You better watch that big rock wallet head. W.M. Lloyd Garrison, Boston, May 1st, 1845. Just about, sir. I got like 4 pages. 4 pages. 4 pages now. A letter from Wendell Phillips, Esquire, on Boston, April 22nd, 1845. My dear friend, you remember the old fable of the man and the lion, where the lion complained that he should not be misrepresented when the lions wrote history. I am glad the time has come when the lions write history. We have been left long enough to gather the character of slavery from the involuntary evidence of the masters. One might, indeed, rest sufficiently satisfied with what it is evident must be, in general, the result of such a relation, without seeking farther to find whether they have followed in every instance. Indeed, those who stare at the half peck of corn a week, and love to count the lashes of the slave's back, are seldom the stuff out of which reformers and abolitionists are to be made. I remember that in 1838, many were waiting for the results of the West India experiment before they could come out into our ranks. Those results have come long ago, but alas, few of that number have come with them as converts. A man must be disposed to judge of emancipation by other tests than whether it is increased the produce of sugar, and to hate slavery for other reasons than because it starves men and whips women, before he is ready to lay the first stone of his anti-slavery life. I was glad to learn that in your story, how early the most neglected of God's children waken to a sense of their rights and in the injustice done to them. Experience is a keen teacher, and long before you had mastered your ABCs or knew where the white sails of the Chesapeake Bay were bound, you began, I see, to gauge the wretchedness of the slave, not by his hunger and want, but by his lashes and toil, but by the cruel and blighting death which gathers over his soul. In connection with this, there is one circumstance which makes your recollections peculiarly valuable and renders your early insight the most remarkable. You come from the part of the country where we are told slavery appears with its fairest features. Let us hear then what it is at its best estate. Gaze on its bright side, if it has one, and then imagination may task her powers to add dark lines to the picture as she travels southward to that, for the colored man, valley of the shadow of death, where the Mississippi sweeps along. Again, we have known you long and can put the most entire confidence in your truth, your candor, and sincerity. Everyone who has heard you speak has felt, and I'm confident everyone who reads your books will feel persuaded that you give them a fair specimen of the whole truth. No one-sided portrait, no wholesale complaints, but strict justice done. Whenever individual kindliness has neutralized for a moment the deadly system with which it was strangely allied. Man, there's some words in here. You have been with us too some years and can fairly compare the twilight of rights which your race enjoy at the north with the noon of night under which the labor south of Mason and Dixon line. Tell us whether, after all, the half-free colored man of Massachusetts is worse off than the pampered slave of the rice swamps. In reading your life, no one can say that you have unfairly picked out some rare specimens of cruelty. We know that the bitter drops, which even you have drained from the cup, are no incidental aggravations, no individual ills, but such is most mingle always necessary, but such as must mingle always necessarily in the lot of every slave. They are the essential ingredients, not the occasional results of the system. Mhm. Man, after all, I shall read your book with trembling for you. Some years ago, when you were beginning to tell me your real name and birthplace, you may remember I stopped you and preferred to whether to thank you. I hardly knew at the time whether to thank you or whether to thank you or not for the sight of them. When I reflected that it was still dangerous in Massachusetts for honest men to tell their names. They say the father in 1776 signed the Declaration of Independence with the halter about the necks. You too published your Declaration of Freedom with danger compassing around you. In all of the broad lands which the Constitution of the United States overshadows, there is no single spot, however narrow or desolate, where a fugitive slave can plant himself and say, I am safe. The whole armory of the Northern law has no shield for you. I am free to say, I am free to say that in your place I should throw the MS into the fire. You perhaps may tell your story in safety, enduring as you are, so to many warm hearts, and by rare gifts, and still rarer devotion of them to the service of others. But it will be owing only to your laborers and fearless efforts to those who trample the laws and consideration of the country under their feet. Man, my bad. I was trying to listen for the boys and damn it fell asleep. I was trying to listen for the boys and damn it fell asleep. That monster was on me. Sleep. But it will be owing only to your laborers and the fearless efforts of those who, trampling the laws and constitution of the country under their feet, are determined that they will hide the outcast and that their hearts or hurts shall be, spite of the law, an asylum for the oppressed, if sometime or other the humblest may stand in our streets and bear witness in safety against the cruelties of which he has been the victim. Yes, it is sad to think that these very throbbing hearts which welcome your story and form your best safeguard in telling it are all beating contrary to the statute of this in such case made and provided. Go on, my dear friend, till you and those who, like you, have been saved so as by five from the dark prison house, so as by fire from the dark prison house shall stereotype these free, illegal pulses into statutes, and New England, cutting loose from the blood-stained union, shall glory in being the house of refuge for the oppressed, till we no longer merely hide the outcast or make a merit of standing idly by while he is hunted in our midst, but consecrating anew the soil of the pilgrims as the asylum for the oppressed, proclaim our welcome to the slaves so loudly that the tones shall reach every hut of the Carolinas and make the broken-hearted bondmen leap up at the thought of the old Massachusetts. God speed the day. Till then and ever, yours truly, Wendell Phillips. To Frederick Douglass. Now we get to chapter 1. We are finally at chapter 1. Shalom, spiritual conversation, and shalom. Well, finally to chapter 1. After all that, after all that humbuggery. Chapter 1, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far, the largest part of the slaves know as little of their age as horses know of theirs. And it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell me his birthday. They seldom come nearer to it than plant time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not all such, the same privileges. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. The nearest estimate I can give makes a now between 27 and 28 years of age. I come to this from hearing my master say, sometime during 1835, I was about 17 years old. My mother was named Harriet Daly. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My mother was of a dark complexion. Then either my grandmother or grandfather. My mother was of a dark complexion. Then either my darker. That's why it's not sounding right. DJ done? All right. My mother was a darker complexion than either my grandmother or grandfather. My father was a white man, and was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father. But of the correctness of this opinion, I know nothing. The meaning of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant. Before I knew her as my mother, it is a common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Yeah, I'm barely up. Let me go. Give me a second right quick. Let me go get my son off the toilet. And I'll be right back. Come on, hurry up. Let's go. My bad. My bad. Oh, Lord. Why didn't you say that when I was in there? All right, come on, let's go. Be right back. All right. My mother was named Harriet Daly. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My mother was a darker complexion than either my grandmother and grandfather. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father, but the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It was a common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Frequently, before the child has reached his 12th month, its mother is taken from it. Now, and hired out on some farm of a considerable distance off. And the child is placed under the care of an old woman, too old for field labor. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection toward its mother, and to be blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. I never saw my mother. To know her as such more than 4 or 5 times in my life. And each of these times was very short in duration and at night. She was hired by a Mr. Stewart who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave has special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom got, and one that gives it, and one that gives to him that gives it a proud name of being a kind master. I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother being by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. That soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old on one of the master's farm near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or her burial. She was gone long before I knew anything about it, never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care. I received the tidings of her death with much of the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. Called thus suddenly away, she left me without the slightest intimation of who my father was. The whisper that my master was my father may or may not be true, and true or false, it is of but little consequence to my purpose work whilst the fact remains. In all its glaring odiousness, that slaveholders have ordained and by law established that the child of the slave woman shall in all cases follow the condition of their mothers, and this is done to obviously to administer to their own lust and make a gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable. For by this cunning arrangement the slaveholder, in cases not a few, sustains to his slaves the double relation of master and father. I know in such cases, and it is worthy of remark, that such slaves invariably suffer greater hardships and have more to contend with than others. They are, in the first place, a constant offense to their mistress. She is ever disposed to find fault with them. They can seldom do anything to please her. She is never better pleased than when she sees them under the lash, especially when she suspects her husband of showing to his mulatto children favors which he withholds from his black slaves. The master is frequently compelled to sell this class of his slaves out of deference to the feelings of his white wife. And cruel as the deed may strike anyone to be, for a man to sell his own children to human fleshmongers, it is often the delicate and humanity. It is often the dictate of humanity for him to do so. For unless he does this, he must not only whip them himself, but must stand by and see one white son tie up his brother of but few shades darker complexion than himself, and ply the gory lash to his naked back. And if he lists one word of disapproval, it is set down to his parental partiality, and only makes a bad matter worse, both for himself and the slave whom he would protect and defend. Every year brings its multitudes of this class of slaves. It was doubtless in consequence of the knowledge of this fact that one great statesman of the South predicted the downfall of slavery by the inevitable laws of population. Whether this prophecy is ever fulfilled or not, it is nevertheless plain that the very different looking class of people are springing up out of the South and are now held in slavery from those who originally brought to this country from Africa. And if their increase will do no other good, it will do away the force of the argument that God cursed Ham. And therefore, American slavery is right. If the lineal descendants of Ham are alone to be spiritually enslaved, it is certain that slavery at the South must soon become unspiritual. For thousands are ushered into the world annually who, like myself, owe their existence to white fathers, and those fathers most frequently their own masters. I have had two masters. My first master's name was Anthony. I did not remember his first name. He was generally called Captain Anthony, a title which, I presume, he acquired by sailing a craft on the Chesapeake Bay. He was not considered a rich slaveholder. He owned 2 or 3 farms and about 30 slaves. His farms and slaves were under the care of an overseer. The overseer's name was Plummer. Mr. Plummer was a miserable drunkard, a profane swearer, and a savage monster. He always went armed with a cow skin and a heavy cudgel, not cudgel. I have known him to cut and slash a woman's head so horribly that even Master would be enraged at his cruelty and would threaten to whip him if he did not mind himself. Master, however, was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of the day by the most heartrending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, who he used to tie up to a joist and whip her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from his bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush. And not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I even witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I will remember it. But I well remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be the witness and participant. It struck me with an awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. This occurrence took place very soon after I went to live with my old master. And under the following circumstances, Aunt Hester went out one night, where or for what I do not know, and happened to be absent when my master desired her presence. He had ordered her not to go out evenings and warned her that she must never let him catch her in company with a young man who was paying attention to her, belonging to Colonel Lloyd. The young man's name was Ned Roberts, generally called Lloyd's Ned. Why Master was so careful of her may be safely left to conjecture. He didn't want that boy to do or something. He was like, that's for me. She was a woman of noble form and of graceful proportion, having very few equals and fewer superiors in personal appearance among the colored or white women of our neighborhood. Aunt Hester had not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in company with Lloyd's Ned, which circumstance I found, from what he said while whipping her, was a chief offense. He had been a man of pure morals himself. He might have been thought interested in protecting the innocence of my aunt, but those who knew him will not suspect him of any such virtue. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen and stripped her from the neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. He then told her to cross her hands, calling her at the same time a damn bitch. You damn bitch. After crossing her hands, well, that's not funny, but it's funny. He tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, put in for the purpose. The whipping Joyce, huh? He made her get upon a stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched out at their full lengths, so that he stood upon the ends of her toes, so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. He then said to her, "Now, you damn bitch, I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay on the heavy cow skin, and soon the warm, red blood, amid heart-rending shrieks from her and horrid oaths from him, came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified, horror-stricken at the sight, that I hid myself in a closet and dared not venture out till too long after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation, where she was put to raise the children of the younger women. I had therefore been until now out of the way of the bloody scenes that often occurred on the plantations. Ah, man. That was chapter 1. That was the preface, the notes, and chapter 1 of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Man, we're going to probably read a couple of, I know I already went an hour and a half, so we're good for today. But on these other chapters that's coming up, man, they short chapters for the most part. So I'll probably read a couple of chapters a day. But we'll keep pushing, man. Thank y'all for those who stuck with me, man. It's Reading with Shilo, and we're reading the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, a Dover thrift edition. A Dover thrift edition. And we'll keep pushing to see what we can see. What can we learn and grow from? What can we learn and grow from? Through the narrative of Mr. Frederick Douglass's life, man. Because even though we have a lot of televised stuff these days, a lot of this stuff still goes on. A lot of this stuff still goes on. You know, the things that how can we make adjustments for ourselves? How can we use his knowledge, his experience to make the adjustments that we need to make? You know, one of the main adjustments that I think we need to make is what I'm doing, which is reading. It said that he wasn't taught to read and write until he went to another slave master, and they was so surprised to the point that people didn't believe that he was ever a slave. You know, so if Frederick Douglass could do this with little or no, prior history of training, then what can you do with little or no prior history of training? If only you just take the time to, take the time to do it. Take the time to read. Take the time to learn. You know, what can you do yourself? Shit. A lot of the carvings that I'm doing now is because I've taken the time to read and to learn. So I get what comes from it. You will get what comes from it. Yeah, but that's it for the day, man. That is it for the day. Shalom, everybody. Shalom, everybody. Thank y'all for the likes, comments, messages. Welcome to all the new subscribers to Reading with Shilo. We're gonna keep pushing, man. We're gonna keep pushing book after book after book, and we're gonna keep learning, and we're gonna keep growing, and we're gonna start putting some other stuff on there, man. I'm gonna start doing some of my carvings on live. We'll see how that goes. But man, shalom, Shilo out. Till next time, man. Rock with me.